Michael Young was one of the most fascinating and stimulating people I've ever known. He lit slow fuses in the mind. I treasured every conversation I ever had with him, and I wish there'd been more, many more. I was enriched by his company and honoured to possess his friendship, and I'm deeply honoured to speak in his memory this evening on the theme of Meritocracy Revisited. Michael, I think, was a connoisseur's social analyst and social entrepreneur for many reasons, several of which I shall touch on this evening. But with his notion of meritocracy, he is one of only 3 people I've known to have invented a word that has not only stuck to the Velcro of collective memory, but has also made it into the dictionaries. The other 2 are the great elections expert Sir David Butler with psephology, and Norman McRae, luminary of The Economist magazine for decades, with stagflation. Those are the only 3 I've known. I first met Michael, as it were, through the punch of that word meritocracy in someone else's pages. In Anthony Sampson's Second Anatomy of the UK, the New Anatomy of Britain, which I received as a 6th form prize at Marling School, Stroud, in the autumn of 1965. There it was, meritocracy, with its attendant fissile formula, IQ plus effort equals merit. Now, as a grammar school boy and a bit of a swot, though I tried zealously to conceal it, and a classic product of Rab Butler's 1944 Education Act, I smelt not a whiff of anything wrong with that equation of IQ plus effort equals merit. For me, it was a manifesto, and it was a self-evident truth rather than a warning of what the unbridled pursuit of meritocracy could do. And not until I finally read Michael's classic 1958 fusion of historical sociology, satire, horizon scanning and prediction in The Rise of the Meritocracy, did I really inhale the fact that this was a warning, that Michael was foreseeing another and once established irreversible social and economic deprivation that would, and these are my words, not Michael's, rank alongside William Beveridge's famous 5 giants on the road to reconstruction of his eponymous November 1942 report on social insurance. Do you remember them? Ignorance, idleness, squalor, disease, want. They don't write white papers like that anymore. If IDS wrote a DWP white paper like that, he would be offered counselling, at the very least. But as a result, Beveridge Report sold 750,000 copies. IDS's productions are read by just about the number of us in this room. That's a bit unkind, I take it back. For Michael did see the possible rise of a society which valued intelligence above all other characteristics as a giant blemish, a society in which the intellectual haves regard the also-rans and the have-nots with disdain and without a trace of the noblesse oblige or compassion that had mitigated some of the worst effects of the ancien regime of an aristocracy based on blood and inherited wealth rather than little grey cells. If we could rise, have risen by our own efforts, hoisted up by our own synapses, as it were, so could they, if they put their minds to it, now that higher education is increasingly available. That was the meritocrats' cry. Thinking about this evening's lecture on holiday this summer, I talked about Michael and meritocracy to my daughter Polly, who's a history teacher near Sheffield, in Staveley, and in a comprehensive. And Polly said quite simply, meritocracy needs to provide worthwhile and fulfilling jobs for everybody, regardless of their born abilities. And Michael was shot through with that feeling, which my daughter Polly naturally shares. Pondering what she said prompted the thought that the rise of the meritocracy might have been Michael's way of projecting his 1950s thoughts about family and kinship onto a British scale through the medium of educational opportunity and reward. Could it be that Michael, like George Orwell, in his great 1940 essay The Lion and the Unicorn, saw our country as a family with the wrong members in control? That was Orwell's phrase, as you remember. Certainly, he foresaw, Michael did, the wrong mix at the top in the new establishment that would be created once the meritocracy, in his fictional treatment of the post-1958 era, had risen. A society lacking a sense of natural familyhood or real kinship between the meritocratic possessors and those they regarded as the laggards or the dullards. Michael doesn't draw directly on Orwell in The Rise of the Meritocracy, but there is one thinker-writer with a special eye for his country who suffuses Michael's pages. For Michael's dystopic vision is partly built on the analysis of his great hero, the saintly economic historian R.H. Tawney, in his classic work Equality, first written in 1931 and updated in 1952. Tawney believed that deep in our collective DNA as a country, there was a potent, trumping molecule, a powerful British impulse towards inequality. Tawney liked to quote Matthew Arnold on the capacity of we Brits to turn inequality into almost a religion. One of Tawney's multiple prescriptions for a better society was ever-improving education for all, a view Michael naturally shared in full. But Michael took a step further than Tawney in The Rise, as I'll call the book for short. Michael, in the historical section of the book, with that gift for epigram he possessed, had summed up the long, grinding, and never entirely complete shift from feudalism to capitalism in these words: the soil grows castes, the machine makes classes. Wonderful encapsulation. The soil grows castes, the machine makes classes. Such a society, Michael declared in the speculative futurological section of The Rise, was a stratified society prepared by habit of mind to recognize a hierarchy of intelligence as soon as it was pointed out. And the pointing out in a Britain to come that Michael foresaw from the observation post of the mid to late 1950s was a trading nation and slipping former great power in the world that plumped for the unleashing of a full throttle, unashamed meritocracy as a way of coping with global competition and reversing relative decline. It was, though Michael didn't put it this way, a matter of merit or die. His argument was that economic and competitive pressures, or his fear was rather than his argument, would finally force the UK to end what Michael called the perpetual struggle between kinship and merit in favour of merit. The old class system, with its inefficiencies, absurdities and injustices, would be swept away, only to replace an aristocracy of birth with a meritocracy of talent that would, unlike the oldocracy it was killing off, be both unreformable and irreversible. Until, that is, the riots and social disturbances of 2034, with which The Rise ends, and during which Michael's alter ego, the narrator in the book, the social analyst of the book, in whom Michael places his thoughts and words, is killed. The moral being that all seemingly triumphant ocracies, like all empires, light a fuse beneath themselves. It is only a matter of time. Michael, I'm sure, was deadly serious in writing The Rise, but he also had fun along the way. When I reread the book earlier this year for the purposes of this evening's lecture, I jotted down a few of the forecasts about Britain and the world between 1958 and 2034 that he foresaw, happening in the interim, as it were. Here they are in no particular chronological order or order of magnitude. Some happened, some didn't, some still might happen. The rise of China, it's all there. A daily shuttle from Earth to the moon. We can't even get the HST going, so that's a bit that's faintly remote. The UK becoming a province of Europe, discuss. The rise of computers and artificial intelligence, and how. A growing north-south divide within the UK, regrettably, happened. The rise of automation in industry and commerce, and with it technological redundancy among the workforce, happened. A widespread return of domestic service, outside bits of this city, not yet. The end of hereditary peerages, that'll be the day, with the House of Lords, which Michael himself joined as Lord Young of Dartington in 1977, transformed into a citadel of meritocracy, and the chamber in which the Prime Minister sits by the end of the book. No, not yet. They do in the end, they all end up there, except John Major, which is a pity. Macmillan did in the end, it took a long time. I think I remember it rightly, explained to a friend of mine, it's very good beyond a certain age, the House of Lords, if you're a bloke, because there's a bar within 25 yards of you, wherever you are, and a loo. There are many other reasons, of course, for the House of Lords, I think, has virtues, but certainly for Uncle Harold Macmillan, that was one of them, but I digress. Together with the meritocratised, if a terrible verb, House of Lords and the meritocratic career civil service, they would dominate a deteriorating, though elected House of Commons. That's what he foresaw. And finally, not yet this one, a discovered ability to control the weather, for example, by bringing on autumn early. I don't know where he got that from. The rise of the meritocracy is, in a strange way, literally a touchstone book. Historians, social scientists, commentators and politicians go back and touch it, consult it, when they try to make sense of the vectors, forces and contingencies as they, for better or worse, play out. The legs the rise has acquired over the years since 1958, I think, are all the more remarkable because, as Michael wrote in the introduction to a new 1994 edition, for some years I thought the book was doomed never to appear. I hawked it round from one publisher to another, 11 of them, and was always turned down. It was finally published at all because I happened to meet an old friend, Walter Neurath, on a beach in North Wales. He and his wife Eva started a publishing house, Thames and Hudson, which has become highly renowned on both sides of the Atlantic for its books on the arts. Sociology was not among its interests. Neurath published my book out of friendship. Soon after the book was first published, Michael went on, it was taken up by Penguin and sold hundreds of thousands of copies, as well as appearing in 7 translations. I've sometimes wondered, said Michael, what on earth Japanese readers make of it. In that same 1994 introduction, Michael was interesting on why the rise should have caught on. It must, he concluded, have been partly the title. I had doubts about the key word which I made up. A friend, a classical scholar, said I would be breaking the rules of good usage to invent a word out of one Latin and one Greek word. I would, she said, be laughed to scorn if I did. How our country's changed. In the event, that's me, not Michael, in the event the book has been subjected to much criticism, said Michael, but not on grounds of bad taste about the title, rather the opposite, I would say. Now, why did Michael believe this? Because he reflected the 20th century had room for the word. People of power and privilege were readier than ever to believe that modern society, in the language of the book, has rule not so much by people as by the cleverest people, not an aristocracy of birth, not a plutocracy of wealth, but a true meritocracy of talent. The association, thought Michael, with the aristocracy was particularly formidable. Some people like to congratulate themselves on being like aristocrats, but going one better by earning power and privilege on merit. Aristocracy, said Michael, went wrong because so many of the people who had power, simply because they inherited it from their parents, were clearly unfit to exercise it. Nobody should be born with a silver spoon in their mouth, said Michael, or if he is, it should choke him. There was another reason, I think, why the rise caught the mood. It was because Michael's friend, the great American sociologist Daniel Bell, and others were proclaiming, wrongly as it turned out, in the 60s, that the globe was being reshaped by the end of ideology and being made increasingly safe for the ever more indispensable, gifted and technocratic. I'll return to Daniel Bell shortly. The rise certainly attracted attention as soon as it was published by Michael's peers and intellectual contemporaries. His friend Noel Annan, himself no mean historical sociologist, wrote a book about his and Michael's generation which he called Our Age, published in 1990. 30 years earlier, Annan recalled, the confident virtues of the post-1944 Butler Act system of schooling divided into grammar and secondary moderns with a thin sprinkling of technical schools scattered amongst them were fraying a little at the edges. By the late 50s, wrote Noel Annan, the soul of justice awoke from its slumbers. A few dons were asking who had benefited from Butler's Act. A young Cambridge economist, John Vasey, turned himself into an expert on the economies of education, or the economics of education. He found the Ministry of Education deficient in the most elementary statistics, and his work showed that Britain was spending a lower proportion of its national income on education than it did in the depths of the Depression in the 30s. Jean Flood showed that the successful children in secondary schools were those who had literate parents. David Glass and Richard Titmuss at LSE that the main beneficiaries of the Butler Act, even of the welfare state, were the middle classes. This, I think, and Noel Annan thought, was the sociological and analytical climate into which the rise emerged in the late 50s and early 60s. Its impact all the greater because it was written as a rattling good story, shot through with satire and built around a paradox. The indispensable need for a society and an economy powered by brains, yet in danger of ceasing to be a decent society in the very process, and all in the name of social advance. Suddenly, wrote Noel Annan, the very notion of meritocracy and elite began to be attacked. In 1958, Michael Young wrote a book that caught the imagination of our age. In The Rise of the Meritocracy, he imagined what would happen when academic and intellectual merit was the acknowledged criterion for all posts and jobs, from Prime Minister to dustman. By 2033, everything had gone according to plan, but unaccountably, the workers began to rebel. They excluded the non-meritorious losers amongst the unskilled male workforce, in Michael's story, allied with clever radical women graduates to form the Populist Party, a grouping Michael's narrator in The Rise does not take seriously when writing his great essay in 2033. Anticipating the planned rally in Manchester at Peterloo, the very same site as the Great Rising in 1819, this was going to take place in May 2034, Michael's essayist ventures his own forecast. This is what he wrote. "Behind the shift and turn of current politics is the underlying fact with which I open my essay. The last century has witnessed a far-reaching redistribution of ability between the classes in society, and the consequence is that the lower classes no longer have the power to make revolt effective. For a short moment they may prosper through an alliance with the odd and passing dissolution of a sector of the upper classes, but such déclassé people can never be more than an eccentric minority. The populists have never been more than that as a serious political force, because the elite is treated with all the wise distinction that any heart can desire. Without intelligence in their heads, the lower classes are never more menacing than a rebel." This is Michael's narrator, who carries on. "If the hopes of some of earlier dissidents had been realised, and the brilliant children from the lower classes remained there to teach, to inspire, and to organise the masses, then I should have had a different story to tell. The few who now propose such a radical step are 100 years too late. That is the prediction I shall expect to verify when I stand next May listening to the speeches from the great rostrum at Peterloo." So end the words of Michael's essayist, narrator, champion and historian of the risen meritocracy. But the book itself finishes brilliantly and unforgettably and classically in a Michael way with this footnote. "Since the author of this essay was himself killed at Peterloo, the publishers regret that they were not able to submit to him the proofs of his manuscript for the corrections he might have wished to make before publication. The text, even in this last section, has been left exactly as he wrote it. The failings of sociology are as illuminating as its successes." Don't you think that's a fabulous ending? Michael, with that ending, leaves his story, the notion of meritocracy, and us, his readers, up in the air, deliberately so. And successive commentators who've used the book over the 55 years since it hit the shelves have been floating atop its paradoxes too. Michael, I think, would have been pleased by that. Now, why do I say that? Because in his 1994 reflection, he recognised that the growth of mass educational provision had been one of the most significant phenomena of the 20th century. That a basic education, said Michael, has been regarded as a universal right, and that if there has to be selection at some rung on the educational ladder, as there always has to be, selection should surely not be on the basis of the parent's position or wealth, but according to the merit of the child or youth. That practically and ethically, a meritocratic education underpins a meritocratic society. Therefore, as Michael wrote in 1994, The Rise of the Meritocracy was intended to present two sides of the case against as well as the case for a meritocracy. It's not a simple matter and was not intended to be. The 2 points of view are contrasted throughout. The imaginary author has a shadow. The decision one way or another was and is left to the reader, the hope being that on the way to making up his or her mind on one of the great issues of modern society, he or she will also have a little fun. Hence the satire. The book and the ocracy it unleashed upon the world have had and continue to have a remarkably percussive effect, and the word meritocracy can be dropped into conversation in a way that is easily understood and carries a lot of freight. Just a couple of recent personal examples. Shortly before Christmas last year, the BBC's Parliament channel invited Lord Carrington, Bernard Donahue and myself to take part in a studio discussion titled 1963, A Year to Remember. At the end, we were each asked to sum up the significance of 1963. Bernard, Grammar School, Oxford, Labour peer, said 1963 was the year meritocracy came in, part of closing the door on the old and bringing in the new. Second recent example, just after Easter, for reasons a bit complicated to explain, I was underwater aboard a Royal Navy Trafalgar-class submarine, HMS Talent, somewhere off the Isle of Arran, and talking to its really rather direct and energetic captain, Commander John Aiken. "What do you like about the submarine service?" I said. John replied, "It's a true meritocracy. Your background didn't matter. Whether or not you could do the job was all that counted," which is a bit of relief when you think of the nature of submarines. If ever there is a case for meritocracy, it is on one of Her Majesty's submarines. That's me, not John Aitken. Of course, such sentiments were plentiful long before Michael coined the word meritocracy. My favourite, early and pleasing and pithy example is Ludwig van Beethoven's formulation. Asked if the van in his name indicated that he was an aristocrat, the great composer, who was not a jolly person at all, faintly acid, the great composer replied, "I'm not a landowner, I'm a brain owner." Terrific. Lately, I've been reading up on the road to war in 1914. And in Margaret Macmillan's marvellous new book, The War That Ended Peace, there's a telegram drafted by the German ambassador in London, Count Paul Metternich, for transmission to Berlin in 1903, when the great dreadnought-driven Anglo-German naval race is getting into its stride. This is what he wrote. "The least ill humour towards us prevails in the higher circles of society, perhaps also in the lower classes of the population, but all of those that lie in between and who work with brain and pen, the great majority, are hostile to us." Meritocrats against the Kaiser, one might call them. Not that Metternich did. Michael, in 1958, drew, I think, into a single word a great many ingredients in what Harold Perkin called the rise of professional society in Britain. Formal recognition that the word had arrived naturally came from the Oxford English Dictionary, and I'm taking this from the 1989 edition. Meritocracy. Government by persons selected on the basis of merit in a competitive educational system. A society so governed, a ruling or influential class of educated people. First use, Michael Young, The Rise of the Meritocracy. Meritocracy pretty well instantly became one of the qualitative measures of post-1958 British society. As a quantitative indicator, I think it's more problematic. It would be a very brave social scientist, and I'm neither brave nor a social scientist, who attempted an RMI, a relative meritocracy index, or placed too much weight upon such an indicator if indeed it was possible to create one. However, there is a fascinating book to be written, a work of special social cartography mapping meritocracy in Britain since the passage of the 1944 Education Act. I'm not a sociologist or a social scientist by trade or training, so I'm not the one to attempt it, but I hope somebody will, perhaps somebody in this room. There are some natural cartographers of relative equality who are convinced that a good proportion of Michael's fears were realised. And they've written very well on it. And here, for example, is Roy Hattersley last August writing in The Guardian about a book that changed me, Tawney's Equality. "Some passages in Equality entranced me by their majestic certainty," wrote Roy. 50 years before meritocracy was elevated from Michael Young's satire on selfishness into a social system devoutly to be wished, Tawney dismissed equality of opportunity in two irresistible sentences. "It is only the presence of a high degree of practical equality which can diffuse and generalise opportunities to rise. The existence of such opportunities depends not only on an open road, but upon an equal start." It's interesting that Roy Hattersley alights on the 1980s as the hour of the meritocracy selfish version. In Michael's speculative forward look in the book, the 1980s were key, though in Michael's fantasy, it was Crosslandite democratic socialists in a future Labour government, people like Roy Hattersley himself, whom he foresaw as the propellants of the meritocracy, or of the reversing of the economic decline school. He thought it would be a centre-left government that would do it. Instead, it was a succession of Conservative governments fuelled by Mrs Thatcher's free market economic liberalism that set out to do this. Indeed, the very month the grammar school and Oxford-educated lady became leader of the Conservative Party in February 1975, Margaret Thatcher, speaking to the Young Conservatives Conference in Eastbourne, placed the principle of meritocracy firmly at the centre of her battle standard. "I believe," she declared, "we should judge people on merit and not on background. I believe the person who is prepared to work hardest should get the greatest rewards and keep them after tax." But how far did the meritocracy rise post-1979, when Mrs Thatcher stepped into Downing Street? This question would surely be central to our scholarly cartographer of meritocracy since 1945. What other ingredients might he or she inject? And here are a few thoughts. And bear in mind, I'm not the one to do it, and I'm not sociologist or social scientist. It's just thoughts from a historian to somebody who I hope will do it. First, the ocracies that rose, which Michael did not foresee. And this is not a criticism because he foresaw so much. For example, celebritocracy, the famous for being famous phenomenon which has spread like a glittering rash since the late 1950s. When Michael was publishing The Rise, there were two examples of celebritocracy that I can remember. One was Nora Docker, Lady Docker. Do you remember Lady Docker with her gold-plated Daimler, inviting miners aboard her yacht in Poole Harbour? Fabulous. Loved that Lady Docker. And Gilbert Harding, who got where he was by being awkward and curmudgeonly on those early quiz shows. But we were almost entirely celebritocracy free in relative terms in the late 50s. So Michael couldn't have foreseen that, and I don't blame him. The rise of the mediocracy, I can't think of a better word, an awful word, is another with its attendant professions, if that's the right word for them, of public relations in all its varieties. The rise of the consulting profession, political as well as management, with all the corrosion that has inflicted on the language of politics and government, which would take a George Orwell to map. In the 80s and 90s, we gave away our language. And all for what? No institution is free of the management babble. What have we done to ourselves? Michael didn't foresee that, but sadly, nor did anybody else. Another rich mix would be the mingling of the establishment notion with the idea of a rising meritocracy. The establishment idea enjoyed a renaissance at much the same time as Michael was marshalling his thoughts on meritocracy, with celebrated pieces from A.J.P. Taylor in The New Statesman and Nation, as it was still called in 1953, and Henry Fairley in The Spectator in 1955. The establishment, a very slippery, imprecise notion. It's hinted at in the section of the Oxford English Dictionary definition of meritocracy, which spoke of a ruling or influential class of educated people. But it would be fascinating, I think, to take a crack at the meritocratic rise in the grand old professions and wider. Allied to the penetration of the meritocratic impulse is the thought raised about Michael's book by Daniel Bell in his look at meritocracy and equality within the pages of his fabled 1973 study of the coming of post-industrial society. Bell answered the question Michael posed by telling us that what we needed, with a nice touch of J.S. Bach, I thought, was a well-tempered meritocracy, which can be a society, said Bell, not of equals, but of the just. Was Michael predicting, in The Rise, the spread of what we would now call a knowledge economy? If so, he was spot on, certainly over the past 30 years. The Work Foundation calculates that the knowledge workers accounted for 31% of the UK workforce in the early 1980s. This, they estimate, would have risen to 45% by next year, by 2014. Over the same period, the skilled and semi-skilled proportion fell from 28% to 18%, and the unskilled from 16% to 9%. Has such an economy spawned what Ferdy Mount, writing about Michael and the rise in his fascinating book, The New Few, called a no hiding place society, in which the material criteria for success have trumped the kindlier human ones. Daniel Bell also wrote of the temptation of the sociologist to morph into sage and seer. Michael Young did exactly that, and how glad I, for one, am that he did so, as the merest glance at the accumulation of his gifts and the gifts he gave us in institutional terms illustrates. For when we think about the cornucopic sweep of Michael's remarkable life, what stands out? Here's my list. A truly rare mixture of the scholarly and the practical. A natural fusing of big sweep questions like meritocracy and equality, state and bureaucracy, their cumulative impact on life chances and liberty. A fusion of all of these with the vital smaller particulars, the crucial detailed elements of making lives better and more buoyantly lived. His immense sensitivity to deprivations and injustices great and small. And, as you all show in this evening's audience, his gift for enlisting platoons, battalions, armies of helpers inside and outside those institutions of social and educational improvement for whose creation he possessed a genius. Finally, my own last memory of Michael, it was when my friend and colleague at Queen Mary, John Davis, went to see him at the Institute for Community Studies in August 2001. Michael was finishing a late lunch, his customary feast, if I recall, of tomato soup and tinned pilchards. A striking manifestation of plain living and high thinking to which I have never aspired, let alone attained, I have to admit. We talked, I think, of meritocracy and of Whitehall. Michael's characteristically slow delivery of his wisdom-freighted words has always left their mark. Michael was a fascinator and an inspirer, a great and a good man. Thank you very much.